He said today it feels good to be an African. This was Thabo Mbeki's expression of pride about a continent rising. The former president has emerged from the shadows to launch the Thabo Mbeki Foundation that will focus on nurturing a new breed of African leader through education and dialogue. The body is designed to take forward the goals of the African Renaissance philosophy which defined Mr. Mbeki's era in power. Former presidents John Kufuor, Joaquim Chissano and Italy's former Prime Minister Romano Prodi have all offered their support and believe now is the time to turn the dream of the African Renaissance into reality. Earlier on, I caught up with President Thabo Mbeki.
Well, the foundation really is dedicated to helping us to address these challenges on the continent. As you know, during all of these years we're in government, this was one of the things that we had to do, to work with everybody on the continent to address issues of peace and security, issues of economic development, issues of relations between the continent and the rest of the world. Those continue to be challenges that we face, including the issue that will be addressed by the African Leadership Institute of really developing a cadre of people around the continent who would sort of be trained and educated and inspired, I hope, to follow up on issues of implementation of a whole range of policies that the African continent has adopted.
Now, those who've been looking and speculating about what the foundation will be doing believe that the philosophy of the African Renaissance is going to be the guiding principle. If so, how will you utilize the philosophy to inspire and advance the work of the foundation?
Well, indeed, I mean, that's what we're about. We are about the African Renaissance. So, and the people who want to attract, for instance, into the training programs, should be people who are committed to that point of view. There are people who won't want to get diplomas and degrees and so on, merely to have a certificate, but to be empowered to do these things that are going to help us to transform Africa. So yes, indeed, it's a vision of the African Renaissance, of African renewal, that we want to pursue, and the conference, which takes place Monday to Wednesday, we convened it to pose this question, to say what really should go into the content of courses which address matters of leadership development. What are these things?
Many people say the African Renaissance, outdated concept. Others are even quite brutal and say it's anti-liberal, it's anti-individualism. It doesn't really advance a new thinking on Africa. How do you respond to that?
Well, you know what the word Renaissance means. It means the rebirth. And I don't know how anybody can say the rebirth of Africa is outdated. It's a very strange concept. It can't be. Not while the continent is facing the challenges it's facing. We were talking about a rebirth because of the problems the continent has, of underdevelopment, of poverty, and all sorts of problems. That it's got to be born anew. To develop, one must address these problems of poverty, of lack of development of the continent, matters of education, of health, and so on. It can't be. You can't say that's outdated unless one says all of Africa's problems have been solved. Let's
talk about the leadership issue, because as part of the work of the foundation is also the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute. And of course we do know the perennial criticism that Africa has a scarcity of good leaders. How will the foundation try to nurture a new breed of leader in whatever form, political or business or civic?
Well, you see, the first thing to do, in my view, the first thing to do really is for us to educate people about these various things which have been adopted by the continent as policies. Because I'm quite certain that many people around the continent are not familiar with these things. I'm not familiar with the fact that there is, in fact, an all-Africa policy on agricultural development. An all-Africa policy on all sorts of things, about democracy, about economic development, and so on. I think that's the first thing to do. Because these are matters which don't require new policies. The policies exist. but the people don't know about these policies and therefore can't implement them. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing then is to answer the question, all right, Africa has got an agricultural development policy. What is it that you would need to do in order to have it implemented? So I think it's that kind of empowerment that is required, or the big challenge on the continent of higher education, in part because of the impact of the brain drain on the continent, but it's a big challenge. So what shall we do about this in order to produce these skilled people which the African continent needs? So these are matters that must be addressed in the development of this leadership.
Education, higher education, and I think this brings us to the point that this is where Africa doesn't have a competitive advantage when it comes to quality of education and the skills deficit. This is even a very South African problem, an impediment to investment. How would the foundation be part of the solution? Well,
you see, there's a larger problem that must be addressed with regard to this. I think people around the continent recognize the importance of that kind of education. Excuse me, university education, other education which gives people various skills. But I think one of the biggest challenges we face, which is something which I think all our governments must address, is indeed that we are losing a lot of people as a continent, a lot of people who've been trained, from nurses and teachers to university professors and so on. And the fact that they get absorbed in these Western countries where they go means that the training is good. So we are training people who are trained, but we are training them for somebody else. So we must answer the question why. And I think that in some instances, it's a question of somebody, for instance, who's trained in the sciences, wants to do research and finds that the conditions don't exist within the country to do that. So they can't develop any further, so they leave. So can't we address this matter? There are other matters which are going to be very difficult to address because people get attracted to these Western countries by higher salaries, which we can't afford. So I'm saying that it's something that needs to be discussed. In the past, the point had been raised that the countries that indeed absorb these Africans trained on the continent really ought to give something back to the continent so that the continent can have more funds to invest in human resource development. So I'm saying that this is a matter that still has to be addressed.
Let's talk about the idea of better economic leadership in Africa. And to your credit, you're credited as the leader that saw South Africa through a growth trajectory over 4.5% even going forward. Jobs were created. We're in the era of emerging markets, and although Africa's growing, we still don't have a competitive advantage when we're faced with competing against the BRIC economies and indeed the next 11 emerging market economies. Through the foundation, how can we engender a spirit of optimum productivity, a growth-focused leadership, and a technical economic approach to development?
You see, if take NEPAD, here's existing African policy on economic development. And so one of the things we've got to say, one of the matters that NEPAD addresses is regional economic integration. That is an important pillar of the development that we want on the continent. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, are we, now this depends on us, are we as a continent moving with the necessary speed to achieve that regional integration? If not, why not? And what should we do about it? So I'm saying there are things that we can do and must do. We had said that it's important for us as Africans to generate the capital that we need. Because indeed there is some capital on the continent, so not just to be looking for people from outside of Africa to bring that capital. we can.
Some say that NEPADs lost its momentum since the three sort of custodians, yourself, President Obasanjo and Bouteflika, have been out of the scene. And because of that, there isn't a coordinated approach to pursuing NEPAD. And there's an urgency because the global economic architecture is changing, and there is a sense that Africa needs to define its role as the world economy changes.
Well, I mean, the NEPAD institutions exist. The process of integration into the African Union has gone ahead, as was agreed. So you also now have that particular pillar, the AU Commission, which should be promoting all of this work of NEPAD. I think what has happened is really, to some extent, that the developed countries, have, I think, to some extent, walked away from their commitments in terms of the NEPAD programs. You could see this recently now when the G8 met in Canada. You would remember that when the G8 met in Canada, 2002, that's where it adopted the Africa Action Plan. It was a very good plan. It was based on NEPAD. And we had thought that when it goes back, when the G8 go back to Canada now, first time since 2002, this indeed would be, they would take up this matter to say where are we with regard to NEPAD, since NEPAD was adopted, since the G8 Africa Action Plan was adopted in Canada. But in reality, it didn't really attend to it. But this was a very important but negative signal of the way I'm saying that I think that these developed countries have to some extent walked away from their commitments, and that's one of the challenges.
All right, just talking about the ethos of leadership. You were South African president for 9.5 years. You were criticized for having an autocratic leadership style. As you go forward with the work of the foundation, nurturing a new breed of leaders, what lessons do you take from your years in high office to correct, if need be, some of the mistakes?
Well, I don't know what anybody meant by being autocratic. No, you see, I think the point to make really about all of these leadership things is, here we are, we have a view, as Africans, we have a view about where the continent should go with regard to its politics. We have a view about where the continent should go with regard to its economy. Now, so the question we must ask ourselves, then how do we get there? How do we get to this point about which we have a view? And so what kind of interventions do you need to make? And who should make those interventions? So I think therefore that in preparing people for that leadership role, it has to relate to what people have to do. If you're a general in an army, of course you command people. That's in the nature of armies. But if you have to mobilize people behind a particular program, you can't command them. You've got to persuade them and convince them. So I'm saying that the manner of the exercise of the function of leadership, it must surely relate to what it is that you want to do to achieve.
The foundation will also be supporting the broader work that you're doing with peace building. So great successes in terms of your helping in the Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo, but again, criticism as to your role in Zimbabwe. When you look at the collective contribution and what the work of the foundation is going to be, what's the approach to peace building and conflict resolution?
Well, I think anybody who's done anything in this area would know that my view is that it's very difficult to apply general rules, because the nature of the conflicts differs from country to country. And therefore, what you might have done with regard to the Congo might be quite irrelevant with regard to Cote d'Ivoire. And Zimbabwe has got its own specifics. And we've said this all the time, and I'm quite sure it's correct, that the solution to the problems of Zimbabwe lies in the hands of the people of Zimbabwe. It lies in the hands of that leadership. And our task was to encourage that leadership to say, let's define this problem together. Yes, and once we've done that, to say, look, how do we solve it? And indeed, I think that's what they have done.
Okay, and a final question to you. It sounds like a lot of work to be done, lots of resources needed. How are you going to sustain the foundation?
We have to raise funds. We've got to raise funds. You are quite right. It's going to require quite a lot of resources, but we're talking to people on the continent, outside the continent, to say, here are the challenges, and people do actually accept that indeed it is important to do this work. It's important to address these challenges. I think the support is there, and I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to raise these required resources, but that indeed they are very needed.